Hi, everyone. Welcome to Scream Sister. This is your friendly podcast all about scary movies and scary books. I am your host, Valerie.
And I'm Veronica.
And we are sisters coming from Texas. Our podcast focuses a lot on Spanish language horror, but it's by no means the all of what we do. We try to cover a bunch of everything because it takes all types. Today is book club episode. Today we are doing our second book pick. Our selection was Vampires of El Norte by Isabel Cañas. We pitched it out on previous episodes. We said this was going to be our discussion book for November, and today is that conversation. We have a lot to get into. I have my beverage. Ronnie, are you partaking of anything?
Once again, iced tea.
So I am holding up. Ronnie can see it. Nobody else can see it. I am holding up
Is there an egg in there?
No, it's like an orange peel.
Oh, I thought
for garnish.
I was like, that's different.
First of all, I want to say the reason you guys can't see the cocktail, but Ronnie can, we had talked about this episode would be a fun one for us to record video and kind of upload it to our YouTube account. And that was the plan. But the reality is that we are just not prepared.
Technically there yet.
We're not technically there yet in terms of like technical equipment and what we need to make that work. But that is something that we do want to do. We definitely want to be able to offer video in some capacity. And we kind of thought the book club episodes would be a good way to do that. So just know we're working on it, but we're not there yet. This episode will just be audio only like they've been, but we will eventually try to start offering video. So anyway,
it's the goal.
So let me talk about this cocktail a little bit, because this was a cocktail that I had gone and dug around for to try to find something for book club, because I thought that might be fun to do. And I went digging around for, I thought to myself, I feel like there has to be a cocktail called the Vaquero. I feel like I've heard that before. So I went digging online, and it just sort of seemed like a lot of what I was finding, there's different kinds of cocktails, and a lot of what I was finding called Vaquero seemed to be more of the daiquiri family in terms of what I had found online. A lot of like muddling pineapple, muddling mint or something like that. And as I was looking through all these different recipes, I was just thinking, all due respect, I just don't feel like the hardworking lifestyle of the true vaquero would be out there muddling pineapple for a cocktail. I have a few bar books that are favorites of mine by Death & Co. They run a few bars around the country, and then they also, like I said, they've done a few cocktail books and kind of history of cocktails and stuff like that. In one of their books, I went digging around, and they have a cocktail called the Vaquero, and it seemed to be more straightforward and more in keeping with what I expect somebody out there on the range or out there on the frontier, so to speak, to maybe go for. So let me just run through the ingredients for you and then tell you how I am failing at doing this correctly. So Death & Co.'s Vaquero cocktail calls for a mezcal and a reposado tequila. I'm gonna mess this up. Demerara syrup, and then a little bit of cream de cow. I found the particular brand of mezcal that they call for, and we're gonna include all of this in our episode notes. But I could not find the tequila that they were calling for. They wanted I think it's called Calle 23 Reposado Tequila. They didn't have that at the store I went to. So the guy hooked me up with Matthew McConaughey's tequila. So that's what it is. It's not bad. I could not find the syrup, and Demerara syrup is more caramelish in color. And so last night, I kind of did a mock-up of the drink last night just to test it out. And it came out very clear, which in the book in online, when you look at pictures of Death & Co.'s cocktail, it looks more like an old-fashioned, more caramel color. So I was very disappointed. I was like, I'm doing this wrong. But we're working with what we got. I mean, it's very booze forward. So, that's the other thing. The risk of betraying our people. I'm not real super big on tequila, but I kind of feel like maybe I just haven't found the right a good tequila. And the same thing with mezcal. Like I don't really have a lot of experience with mezcals. I want to, because I've heard such good things about them. I've heard you can kind of do old fashions and stuff without them. They have like a smoky taste to them, and I'm interested in that. I just haven't found one that I like. This one isn't so bad. I like it. So cheers everybody to that. That's my cocktail for book club. That's my little spiel about it. But anyway,
so even if I did like alcohol and to drink it, and I actually might be willing to try, because maybe we could make that a thing, like always have a themed cocktail to go with whatever book. I'd be willing to try some of them, except I was going to say for those that have tequila, because after a rough experience with tequila in college, you couldn't pay me to touch it again.
That's like me. I had a rough experience in college with vodka. And so for me, I'm like, and again, I probably just haven't had a great vodka. I don't know. But I mean, like the notion of vodka shots, like just straight vodka, but no judgment if that's what you're into. And actually, there was a restaurant here in Austin for the longest time called the Russian House. And it was very sweet. Once the Ukraine conflict broke out, they changed their name as a form of support to Ukraine. But they were great. The Russian House was great. They served truly authentic Russian food. And as part of like the culture and the vibe, the aesthetic that they had in their restaurant, free complimentary vodka shots were served with your meal. So like just one round. They weren't like keeping it coming the entire dinner. And then like my husband did a semester over in Russia.
Did I know that? I don't think I knew that.
Well, I mean, he was young, and so he wasn't. He has beverages now, but he wasn't drinking at the time that he went over. At a certain point, he's like, you can only keep they're so generous, and then his host family took such good care of him, and vodka is part of like meals, what they put on the table and serve. And he's like, you can only politely refuse so many times before you just start to feel like you're being rude. So eventually he did start, imbibing a little bit. That's like 15 minutes that we've wasted talking about booze. Okay, let's get to it. Ronnie and I wanted to spend a little bit of time before we launch into the book and our thoughts on it. We wanted to put a little bit of context for folks about the history that's taking place in the background of this story, because it's really a unique opportunity. As we are Texans, it's a unique opportunity to talk about Texas, because this encompasses regions that would eventually become Texas as we know it.
So the book takes place in like 1840s, and actually Texas had already, and if I'm remembering my history correctly and trying to go online and verifying everything, it's confusing. It's hard to find anything that hasn't been like really sanitized down. But in the 1840s, Texas had, or what we now know as Texas, had pretty much already, it was kind of already its own sovereign state. It had already kind of semi-pulled away from Mexico, didn't belong to the United States quite yet. The president at the time, who, again, if memory serves, was President Polk. He, of the big idea of manifest destiny, the idea that the United States should just push westward and just kind of appropriate everything along the way, wanted Texas and kind of sent troops down into I think what is now near like the Brownsville, along the border area, land that was kind of in dispute, I don't want to say it was a neutral zone, but it was kind of a hotbed. And so he sent the troops in there knowing that Mexico had to, obviously have some sort of response to it. And yeah, just that whole period of Anglos coming down and taking land through various means. Like Valerie, you're reading that book, Killers of the Flower Moon. Well, yeah. Kind of the same
thing. Yep.
Tactics that the Anglos employed to take that land. They employed to take land that had belonged to Mexican families for generations. That's kind of the political feeling and the situation that was existing at the time that Vampires of El Norte is set in.
Yeah.
And again, those are very broad strokes. Valerie will put, the usual resources in the show notes.
Yeah.
Texas history,
which, like Ronnie and I we were lamenting before we started recording. It's just really, Texas is not super great at well-rounded full history teaching. So still not getting worse. It's hard to find accurate information that isn't slanted and that isn't absent of
highly sanitized,
absent of real racial injustices that were occurring. That was a comment that Ronnie made, which is spot on. So I had kind of wanted to talk a little bit about, because it comes up multiple times in the book. She talks about the pinche rinches, yeah. Which is very much a pejorative term for the Rangers. I promise I won't use that throughout the episode. I just wanted to get one in there, so I got it. But she references them throughout the story. And so I thought, well, this might be a good opportunity for us to talk a little bit about the history of the Rangers, the Texas Rangers.
Not the football team.
Not the football team.
I mean, not baseball team. Hello.
Right, whatever. Yeah.
I'm not even drinking.
Do you know how I didn't even miss a beat? I'm like, yeah, the football team.
The baseball team.
The people people they're named for, I guess, presumably. So we'll talk a little bit about that just to sort of give people some context, because I think it's really important for you to understand how Hispanic people in our region and probably in other parts of Texas have conflicting views on the Texas Rangers. It's not all great. The history there is not all great. So let's get into it a little bit. So where the Rinches fit in all of this, I wrote down, if you're of a certain age or you have grandparents, then you've probably heard of shows like The Lone Ranger. Our father was a big fan of The Lone Ranger on television, and certainly many of the old westerns of American cinema have also helped build up this glorified idea of
Walker, Texas Ranger, that Chuck Norris show.
Oh, yeah. Glorified idea of the Texas Rangers is kind of like they were these frontier lawmen, tough as they come, master horsemen, master shots, yada, yada, yada. Even this book I'm reading through, which I'm so close to finishing, Killers of the Flower Moon, features, like, there are people who were former Rangers who would become part of J. Edgar Hoover's, like, the birth of the FBI. So yeah, they feature in that book as well. They were revered for generations and still are, quite frankly, but also, thankfully, in recent years, more and more of the violent history of the Texas Rangers has come to light, and the abuse and corruption, and of course, the racism kind of its origins, and we'll get into that. The Rangers were also known, and this is all of these places where I'm pulling this information from, they're all going to be linked for you guys in the episode notes. The Rangers were also known as Los Diablos Tejanos, or the Devil Texans, amongst the Mexican people, which is interesting because the term Tejano now kind of refers to Texans of Hispanic background. I mean, that's how I look at Tejanos. We don't necessarily, Tejano isn't what we call all Texans, but I guess if you're from Mexico, that is what you would call us. You would call us all Tejanos.
Yeah, I mean, it probably all relative to where you live.
So anyway, let's talk a little bit about their birth very quickly. I don't have a ton of notes, but I have some notes. I have notes and I have a cocktail, so saddle up. We're going for it. As a law enforcement agency, the Rangers were unofficially founded in 1823 by Stephen F. Austin for the purpose of a, quote, punitive expedition against a band of Indians. This is according to the Texas State Historical Association. He wasn't satisfied. Stephen F. Austin wasn't satisfied with the protection the Mexican government was then providing, and he wanted to beef up protections for the people living in his colonies. So he pulled together a group of 10 men, kind of paid them out of his own pocket, and thus the first Ranger Force becomes a thing. Immediately, the argument could be made that they were formed with kind of a vendetta against American Indians in particular. So,
surprise.
Yeah. And, again, I'm pulling this from, in this case, from the Bob Bullock Texas State History Museum, a place I frequent a lot because they have cool exhibits, and they have a lot of new exhibits periodically. Anyway, but as we know, people of Mexican descent would absolutely find themselves in the crosshairs of the Rangers as well. They continued to drive indigenous people from their homelands during the Cherokee War in 1839, as well as the Council House fight and Battle of Plum Creek against the Comanches in 1840. In the mid-1800s, the Rangers captured runaway enslaved Black people seeking freedom in Mexico through the Callahan Expedition. And if you're like, what's that? The Callahan Expedition occurred in October of 1855 when James Hughes Callahan led a force of 111 men into Mexico under the guise of punishing American Indians who there were reports of raids along the Texas frontier that they were attributing to them. And the idea being that after these raids, the Native Americans would return to Mexico where they would be protected by authorities there. What the expedition really was, however, was, as I said, an attempt by Texas slaveholders to capture enslaved Black people who had fled toward freedom in northern Mexico. This violence would go on for years and years. It'll be linked for you guys. There's a great organization here in Texas called Refusing to Forget. They are dedicated toward the education of this history. And they say on their website that between 1910 and 1920, so this is much later, but still very much going, some of the worst racial violence in the United States history was being carried out along the Texas-Mexico border. The violence was carried out against women, men, the young, the elderly, Mexican national, Mexican American. They were killed or attacked, often by people from within or nearby communities, by local law enforcement, and by the Texas Rangers. So 1918 comes along, and the Rangers and other law enforcement are on the hunt near El Paso. They're out looking for the culprits of some cattle raids that had been happening along the border, and they want vengeance. So they reach a village near El Paso, near El Paso called Porvenir, and they round up all of the men and boys because they've decided that these people fit the bill. So this is very much racial profiling, right? And despite no evidence that would link any of these Tejanos to the raids, they separate out 15 men and boys from the rest of people in the village. They separate them, pull them away from their families, and they summarily execute them. It becomes what's called the Porvenir massacre, and none of the rangers involved in those killings were ever prosecuted for their actions. That's been talked about quite a bit in years of late. There's, I think, a documentary, which will make part of our show notes, that's come out in years of late. There's also a really awesome podcast that I will link for you guys called White Hats, put out by Texas Monthly, that kind of dives into this dark history of the Texas Rangers and talks about this massacre in particular. So there is traumatic history there with the Texas Rangers. And so depending on how you grew up or what you were told or exposed to, your opinion of them may be very different.
I don't think I ever heard any stories necessarily good or bad. I mean, I knew what I knew, saw on TV or in movies, but I never really honestly gave them much thought.
Yeah.
You know,
they
education,
weren't like
educating yourself and, knowledge is always a wonderful thing. Reading is a wonderful thing. Don't let anybody ever tell you differently.
As a way of kind of showing you how this abuse of power and racism would persist later on in the 1950s. So much, much later. We're talking 1950s now. The Rangers were at the time helping then Texas Governor Shivers, I don't know, helping that governor defy a federal court order to desegregate a local Texas high school. So it's just something to keep in mind. They have long been the heroes for plenty of Texans, but they have not been lauded as heroes by all. And instead, they've just been a source of deep pain and deep trauma. Get some wiggles out.
Get some wiggles out. What?
Well, that's what I always tell the kids. I'm like, get your wiggles out, because now it's time to hunker down and do stuff.
I'm picturing like the wiggles, like,
No. Like if
head,
you need
shoulders, knees, and toes.
No, like if you need to like shift in your chair or whatever.
Okay.
So
hold on, let me get some wiggles out.
So now we're into it. Let's talk about it. We read Vampires of El Norte. I want a disclaimer. This is a book club episode. We're going to be talking about the book in full. So there will definitely be spoilers. If you have read the book with us, then you are totally cool listening to this episode. If you have not had a chance to read the book and you don't want spoilers, then please stop this episode. Go give the book a read. Come back and listen to it. Ron, what did you think? Just give me your straight gut reaction.
I can't even blame anybody because I picked this book. I mean, it was okay for what it is. Although I'm curious to know what her intent was, because first of all, I want to have words with whoever put this book on a list of horror books, because this is not a horror book. This is pretty much a romance. This is pretty much a romance book, in my opinion.
Like a gothic romance.
Yeah. So I don't know what Isabel Cañas, the author, if she was going for horror, then I think it fails. If she's going for romance, like a historical romance with some minor horror-ish elements,
horror adjacent,
then I think that hit the nail on the head. But is it horror? No. So I'm not the target audience for this book.
And mind you, this was Veronica's first Isabel Cañas book. So
yes.
So Isabel
and now I'm
Cañas,
leery about ever reading the Hacienda.
Well, so I want to point out, because I'm a big fan of Isabel Cañas, and I will always pick up whatever she's newly put out. I like the way she writes. I like her storytelling. This is her second book. Her first book was The Hacienda. I want to be very clear that I and granted it's been a while, but I feel like The Hacienda was very different from this book. Ronnie's right to the point of like, is this true horror? No, but there's something to be said for the way that the horror genre is. There's a lot more merging of genres happening lately that is kind of exciting and kind of frees authors up to write different kinds of stories. And I think like she is one of the folks who is doing this really, I would say, doing it well. Ronnie might have a different opinion. Sylvia Garcia Moreno is another author who I think is merging genres really well. I don't know.
I think her writing itself, I think she's a good writer. I think she can craft, good sentences. She can, create a picture, and she does that well. If her stories are going to lean heavily into the romance,
This was very
then
romance forward.
it's just
Yeah.
not going to be for me, and
Right.
which is
Right.
fine.
Yeah. No. And I mean, and that's the thing to know that I feel is very different from her first book. This book is very romance forward, and even guys, like I don't read gothic romance. I don't really read romance stories. I'm not opposed to it. I don't have a whole lot of experience with that realm. For me, I kind of felt like the horror element, and we'll get to what that is in a bit, but like I felt like that was the B plot in this story when
It's
I
a
would have
C
really
plot.
liked it to be the A plot.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I wouldn't have minded the romance. Well, I might have minded this particular romance, and I'll get more into why. But I think it's funny because Valerie started this book before I did, and so one night she texts me and she goes, "I'm about on chapter 10, and maybe we should consider like a DNF policy so you're not stuck reading books you don't want to read." And I'm like, okay, this does not bode well for.
Well, yeah, because like I mean, chapter 1, I was like in chapter 1 and I was just like, "Oh no. this is not going to go well for her." Again, it's super romance. The romance is the A plot.
Yes,
And
definitely.
so it's a
Marquee billing name
challenge.
and lights is the romance.
It's a challenge. We'll talk about the horror portion of this story, but first I do want to talk about like the characters of the center of the story, these two characters, these two people. Did you like these two people, Veronica?
Well, they're okay. It's just they're so, I'm going to say obsessed. So obsessed and focused with each. And mind you, okay, so this story starts off in, what'd you say, 1836?
1837.
They're
I think
like
is when it
8 or
starts.
9 years old. Okay.
They're kids,
And then
yes,
they're
yeah.
kids. And then there's a time jump 9 years later. So they're like, whatever, what's the math? 21, 20, 21, 20,
Yeah,
21?
like young 20s.
So, and it still reads very young to me. They still read like 13, 14 years old. So, I mean, they were okay, but they just spend so much of their time and energy just ruminating on each other and mooning over each other and pining for each other that it's like, yeah, it starts to get annoying. It's like,
well, it's and you can like, did I like this book as much as the Hacienda? No. Did I like this book? Yeah, I was able to enjoy this book, but I had to really, they are super into each other. They're very Heathcliff and Catherine, like that kind of vibe, like two people from two different worlds, two different social classes. And I hate to reduce, like, I don't mean to distill them down to white focused story like Wuthering Heights, but Wuthering Heights is a relevant for this particular couple who kind of, same scenario, two people deeply in love, childhood sweethearts from different social worlds, destined to grow into those social worlds and be pulled apart. And they're just like very impetuous and passionate and in love with each other.
I mean, like there's this one passage here. It's on page 67 for those that have your book. Now she leaned close enough to him that he could almost taste the bite of wood smoke in her hair that lingered from a morning helping in the kitchen. How it layered over the soapy wildflower smell that rose from her sun-warmed dress. Okay, they are 8 years old when this passage is happening. I mean, it's going to come across like I hated it, and I didn't. It's just not for me.
I liked reading about their childhood and the 9 years that he kind of spent in grief and mourning, believing that she's dead. Because what happens when they're children is that they go out one night, they're going on some adventure to go like dig for treasure, and she gets attacked by a beast, which we later learn are the vampires that are roaming El Norte. And so she gets attacked by this beast, nearly drains her. These characters are Nena and Nestor. Nestor believes her to be dead. And so he believes, because the father is a ranchero, like he owns
ranchero.
Yeah. So he's the ranchero.
He was just a man of that time. He was
man of that time.
He was just strict.
Very strict.
Had certain ideas about his class of people and
his versus
the people that
Vaqueros.
worked under him. Yeah.
Right. And didn't necessarily look kindly on the people that he perceived to be below him. So when he believes his daughter is dead, he is enraged and he kind of looks to Nestor as being responsible. And so Nestor flees and disappears and never returns to the ranch because he believes that she's dead and he's devastated. So that's the background there. And so then I didn't necessarily mind the child stuff or the years where they were apart, or even necessarily when they're rejoined, when he learns that she's not dead, that she's in fact been alive all this time. But as the story progressed into they're now joining the Mexican government. They're going to fight as the militia. She travels with the soldiers or with the vaqueros to be part of their encampments and work as a curandera. The situations that they found themselves in, the life and death situations that they found themselves in, that they're so busy being distracted by the romance about it. I'm like, it goes to one of those things that I think bothers me and Ronnie sometimes about some romance stories, is just like, there is a time and a place for this kind of passion, and it is not when.
I mean, he's laying there with a dislocated shoulder and he's getting all horny because she's taking care of him. I'm like, dude, pop your shoulder back in and then.
And then we can have that discussion. I did find there's a Penguin Random House reader's guide for this. So there are some questions. We can go through some of those. Let's go ahead and talk about like the stuff we liked about the story. So what are your thoughts on the portrayal of the vampires in this story? And why do you think they were written this way?
Well, like you, I would have much preferred for the vampires to be like center stage, for that to be like the A plot, because we never even really got into the lore of the vampires, and why is it just now people seem to be aware of them? I mean, have they not been finding desiccated animal corpses or desiccated people before this? I mean, where did they come from? We never get into the lore of them. They're essentially, and this is why this is a romance book, because in a romance book, everything else is there to serve the romance. So the vampires are the reason why Nestor and Nena are separated in the first place. That's pretty much their function. They don't really even show up. I mean, things are happening with them on the peripheries of the story, like the far edges. You know, you hear people coming down with susto, and so we as the readers know that that's the vampires, but it's happened, you know.
Okay, wait. Explain susto to people who don't know what it is.
I don't know if I can explain it to people who don't know what it is. I know what it is because I know what it is, but how do you explain susto? And I think it's tweaked a little bit for this. I don't remember growing up thinking that people with susto were like thought to be dead or near death.
No. But so I always thought it was like a fear thing, like you were scared.
Yeah, susto is fear.
Like fear-based, but I guess like in this story, the concept of it is, which I don't doubt.
You've almost been scared to death. Like,
scared to death, and like your soul has like, you have to call your soul back to you because like your soul has like left your body out of, you know, that's how deathly afraid you were.
Yeah. So I did like the writing, and I liked the setting, you know, the historical setting, but also the geographical setting, because obviously we live in Texas, so it was kind of cool to come across names and places that we know, San Antonio, Port Isabel, you know, places like that. So I did like that, and she is a good writer.
So to the part of the plot of the vampires, I thought, I would have loved to have seen more of that in the story, because I thought it was so interesting the way she chose to do it. Like, so in the book, guys, for those who don't know what we're talking about, in this book, that we come to find out that the vampires are not exactly the sources of true evil in the story. The sources of true evil are the Anglo soldiers who have weaponized the vampires. So they've trapped them. And so the vampires are more or less perceived as just like wild animals, just beasts, do what they have to do to survive. And are they creatures that are naturally made? Are they creatures of something far more sinister? We don't know. It's never really explored. It's not part of this story. It doesn't serve the romance, I guess, as Ronnie points out. But so they're weaponized by the Anglo soldiers who are using the vampires to unleash them on these Mexican communities and terrorize these people and kill these people and drive them from their land, so that
which seems like a very inefficient way to do this. Because like how many people?
But it's a cool idea. Like I would love to have,
but I don't think
I would love to have seen her expand on that.
I don't think the execution really works, because you know, it's going to take you forever to clear the land of the Mexicans if you're going to just
unleash a ravenous beast
who's going to attack like maybe one person every few nights. And
well, but you know how the rumor mill spreads, and so like as the idea is to inflict terror on these people.
But they didn't seem that terror. Like they didn't seem any real urgency among the people behind figuring out what's causing the susto.
Yeah.
What are these weird marks that bite marks that they have on them? What animal is causing that? Like, there doesn't seem like really any real urgency to me.
That's something that could have been expanded on more if there had been more devotion of this story to that plot. And it's why, Veronica, as I was reading this book, because I was way more interested in that plot than I was necessarily in the romance story, I was thinking, man, you know, like I would I would watch this like as a series. Like I said, I'm not real big on reading gothic romance stuff, but like I'm a fan of Crimson Peak. I like that movie. I'll binge watch a season of Bridgerton. I know Ronnie wouldn't, but I would.
No.
But so like I will watch that stuff totally. I don't always read it, but I'll watch it. And so I was thinking this would make such an awesome series. Like Netflix or HBO need to call Isabel Cañas up and make a deal, because I would watch Vampires of El Norte just to get more of the vampire plot. I think that's
Yeah.
a really cool
I mean,
idea.
where do
I'd
they
love to hear
come
more of it.
from? How did the Anglos get a hold of them? How are they, like you said, did they make them? Did they find them? Like, where did they come from?
Once Mexican communities come to realize what they're doing with the vampires, like what do they do? Like I would love to, there's a whole world that could be built up where we could explore this. And I think that would be.
That's what I wanted to know. I didn't really care if Nestor and Nena ever, reconciled.
Nena, this is one of the questions. Nena and Nestor butt heads a lot. Who did you relate to more? I liked Nestor. Like how much more? I don't know, but I liked him more.
No.
You didn't like him?
If I had to choose it. No, because Nena at least had, I feel like Nestor didn't even really have a story outside of Nena.
Outside of Nena. Yeah.
Like his whole goal was to, be wanted by her, to be loved by her, to marry her.
And to be his own man.
That was again in service to the romance, so that he could
win her,
be worthy of her. It was all Nena at least wanted to be a curandera, wanted to learn from Abuela and follow in her footsteps. Although I don't think either character was, again, because their primary mission was each other, and so. But if I had to choose between one or the other, Nena slightly edges Nestor out, but not by much, because again, I think their primary mission was each other.
So I find that so surprising. That's such a surprise to me, because there were so many parts in the book where Nena annoyed the crap out of me. Because I'm just like, dude, like stop being stupid. I know.
It's like he apologized. He explained what happened, why he ran away.
Exactly. It's like you understand why he would have fled, and it's like you're determined to hang on to your little grudge and stay angry.
When it's not going to last.
So it's interesting. So you favored her slightly more. Do you feel, this isn't part of the question, but this is my question. Do you maybe it is a question. No, it's my question. Do you feel the end of the book, her moment where she finally rises up and finally stands up to her father, do you feel that was maybe, like I felt like I read that and I thought, well, I mean, is that all you had to do? Like this whole book?
Exactly.
That's what you were afraid to do?
But actually, I thought that about the ending of the book just in general. It all kind of resolved a little too neatly, a little too quickly. Even with the vampires, it's like, okay, all you had to do is ask them to leave. Except for the one.
All you had to do is treat them with compassion and look at how that worked out.
I thought we had this whole long book, melodramatic, young romance drama. And then the end just kind of gets wrapped up a little too neatly.
Yeah, but I mean, like I said, I agree. I liked the setting of the story. I think there's some really interesting ideas in the story that I would have loved to have seen expanded. And maybe, I'm serious, Netflix, HBO, call her, make a deal. Like I would love to see this world develop more.
You know what romance I actually would have liked to have seen if it had, I would have liked.
Is it part of this book?
Yes, part of this book. I would have liked if, yes, they grew up and played as children and they kind of latched onto each other as kids, and then up until the age of 13 or 14 when the attack on Nina happens and Nestor thinks she's dead, so he runs off. And so then they're separated for 9 years. But they're holding these images of these 13-year-olds in their heads. Mm-hmm. What I would have liked to have seen, because how many of us really marry our first love? Looking back now, would you want to have married your first love? No. Most of us, we evolve, we change, we grow, we find an adult, mature love that far eclipses anything we felt when we were 13, 14 and thought somebody hung the moon. So what I would have liked to have seen been Nestor and Nena growing up and realizing, yes, you'll always have a special place in my heart, but getting to a place where they've let that go and they've moved on, and maybe Nena could have fallen in love with Beto because I liked Beto.
Well, but wasn't he older? I got the vibe he was older.
No, somewhere in there Nestor's saying that Beto's just acts older, but he's actually just a few years older.
Okay, so not significant. Okay.
I'm thinking maybe like 25,
Okay.
26, something like that. I would have gotten behind a romance like that, where they came together. She forgave him for running off. They kind of let each other go and find an adult, mature love instead of still being stuck in this. It's like they're having emotional arrested development going on here.
I hear you. Although, like, the only way that that would have happened is if, because you could have a situation where Nena and Ness sort of just kind of naturally come to the place mutually that they have great affection for each other, but they're not in love. But I don't. I think there's nothing true to the dramatic.
Well, that would never happen in a romance genre,
Exactly. That's what I'm trying to say.
because
Like that wouldn't happen
that goes
in a
against
story
the
like
rules
this.
of a romance book.
So for that to happen, Nestor would have to die. That's where I thought this book was going. I thought, especially towards the end, where Nestor kind of turns a corner. He's finally confessed his feelings and what his intentions have always been to Nena, and he kind of shifts into a level of naive positivity where he's just like, it's all going to work out and we're going to be together and it'll da, 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 da. And so as you're reading that in these chapters, I was like, oh, this is that's the kiss of death. Like what we know now is that he's not going to come out of this because he's so hopeful.
See, I would have found that interesting.
I know you would have, but like at that point in the story, I was like, if we get to the end of this story and then she kills Nestor, I'm going to be so pissed off. So like, I'm glad that he survived, but I wanted him, like when he leaves the ranch the second time because Nena didn't stand up for him, Nena again failed to like stand up for herself and Nestor and what they have. And so he leaves devastated. Part of me was like, keep going. She didn't stick up for you. Like, forget it. Just keep going. And I guess like the character arc of him is that's what's the word I'm looking for? Impetuous, like just sort of that's what young lovers would have done. They would have just like fled in a hot flash, hot tempers. But he has the wherewithal and at that point, the growth to realize, okay, love isn't just like we get fired up and we storm off. Love is we come back and we realize that what we have is worth fighting for. What we have is worth saving. So like, even though I was irritated with him for turning his horse around, well, like in what we are supposed to accept.
I know,
of
it's
this
just
story.
my cynical me peeking out. See, I like it when authors subvert tropes. So when things happen that you don't see coming, like, did anybody start this story like holding up like anybody's gonna see it? Did anybody read this story ever with any doubt at all that Nestor and Nena were going to end up together? No.
Well, yes, because I can't talk about the hacienda because we're not going to spoil two books in this. But yes, I can, because the hacienda is not like this. The hacienda.
But was that more romance central, or was the romance just kind of? If there even was romance, I don't know. I haven't read it. Was it just
I have to go back and read it, but I felt like the terror element of that story was more of the A plot, and so that's what was so different for me about this story was that
now you're going to make me want to go read that book. And if it turns out that you're leading me astray, Valerie, I know where you live.
It ends differently. That is all I will say. It ends differently. The romance is not the burning A plot. So ultimately, I think what Ronnie and I are getting at is that we would have liked to have seen romance is like, I know romance is not Ronnie's cup of tea. Romance is fine. It's fine. I would have liked to have seen more of the horror element in this story. That would have been really, really cool.
I'm not against romance, people. I'm not like a romance Grinch. It's just, I don't, like Valerie said, I don't like it when it's the A plot. And this particular romance, even if it had been the B or C plot, I don't think I would have gone for it, because I cannot get behind the idea of these people have not let go of their childhood, childlike love for each other. There are certain tropes in every genre. Horror has its tropes, fantasy has its tropes, romance has its tropes. Some you like, some you don't like. There's always going to be tropes. Even if you love the genre, there's going to be tropes in that genre that you don't like. That kind of trope, kind of like that second chance love, I'm not a big fan of, and especially if it's like rooted in childhood. It's just not something that I typically find terribly believable. But I mean, it's a good book for what it is. If you're a romance reader, if you like romance genre, then maybe that's a good measure for, if Veronica hates it, if Veronica, wants to drive ice picks in her eyeballs, then maybe that means it's a banger romance and you should give it a shot. But if you're like me if you're like me and you think Romeo and Juliet were two of the dumbest people to ever be on a page, if you cut a
I
wide
know.
swath around the romance section at the bookstore as though it was ground zero for Ebola and the bubonic plague, then this is not the book for you. So that's my recommendation.
Well,
That's my
and I
thought on it.
and I will tell you, like, from my point of view, even for me, someone who is not necessarily on the opposite side of the spectrum, but maybe maybe more of a centrist when it comes to the element of gothic romance or romance in general. Even for me, this book was a lot. I thought that, like I said, I thought her first novel was a very well done balance. In this novel, the constant threat, which isn't just the vampires, it's also just the Anglo soldiers. It doesn't take the urgency and priority that it should, considering that these are life and death stakes we're talking about. So it felt
Yeah.
like I find it hard that there would be any elements of romance happening during all of that, because it's just like the terror that you would have been living under. And maybe that's just us being too realist for what is ultimately historical fantasy or what have you. But
But I mean, I agree. The elements of the story that I was most interested are the things that are happening at the far edges of the story,
mhm,
because the romance is in the center. And even like I know there's mentions made to like the conflict between socioeconomic classes. So you've got the
mhm,
rancheros and then the peones down underneath. And then of course you've got the issues with Nena kind of pushing against or being feeling confined by the cultural and societal norms of gender expectations of the time. What her role as a woman was going to be in
mhm.
her family and on the ranch. But that's all they're just kind of like these factoids floating around in the ether. They're not really explored to the depth that I would have liked to see them explored, because
Mhm.
just like the vampires are kind of there to be this nebulous kind of background thing, but it's really the thing that caused the separation between our two, star-crossed would-be lovers. The Anglos, the threat of the Anglos coming in, which, like you said, Valerie, it should have been
It's life and death stakes.
it should have been played up more, but it's really more used as the reason to bring Nestor back so that he is back in Elena's orbit.
That's the
That's what
whole
it
reason
is.
he comes back, is
Yeah.
to, yeah.
Is and the rest of it is just, yeah. So I just would have liked, again, if you're into romance and that's the thing you're most interested in, then yeah, this book's going to be bangers for you. But definitely don't go into this expecting horror.
And there are, guys, for the episode show notes, I will link. There are some great podcast episodes out there that talk about Vampires of El Norte that are going to be coming from people who know much about this genre and read this particular genre, the romance, gothic romance. And so I will link those for you. I have not listened to those episodes specifically because I had not read the book. And so I knew at some point I was going to read the book, whether we did it for this podcast or just on my own. So I didn't want to spoil anything for myself. But like, She Wore Black is an excellent podcast. She does a lot of great interviews with a lot of authors of this genre and the horror genres. So she has an interview episode with Isabel Cañas. So go check that out. I'll link that for you. Also, Books in the Freezer, another great podcast that I think also has an episode that talked about this book. I'll go find it and link that as well. Those are also, by the way, Latina podcasts. I do want to read reviews that I thought, like this one in particular, kind of hits on a lot of what Ronnie and I feel coming out of having read this. So this is from Alex Brown for locustmag.com. The title and cover, I'm quoting, the title and cover copy make this novel sound more like a blend of historical fantasy and horror, when in reality it's a historical fantasy romance with a splash of horror. The vampires drive the action, but the bulk of the narrative revolves around the fraught romance between Nestor and Nena. Structurally, this is what he's saying. Structurally, I would have preferred a little less romance and a little more horror. But, all in all, like, he has good things to say about the story too, same as we do. So it's like for our tastes. But
And it goes towards authorial intent. Like, what did Isabel Cañas, was it her intent to write a romance with splashes of horror? Then she did her
yeah,
job. She did
yeah.
it,
Well, what I have heard her say in like, this is, I do not know. I have not listened much to these interviews because, again, I didn't want any giveaways.
Spoilers.
But from what I gather, this yeah, she did intend to kind of make it more romance heavy, and she didn't want to necessarily shy away from that. She wanted to sort of blend those genres a little bit. I think she did. I think this was a story she intended to write, and it's just something to know going forward that you're going to have folks who say, oh, I wish the horror element had been played up more. versus O. I loved it. I thought the romance element was played up just right. Veronica, tell us what we're going to be reading for our next book club pick as we head into December?
Into December. So our next book club pick, which was made on the fly, totally last minute, but it's called Piñata by Leopoldo Gaut, Gout. Leopoldo Gaut is a visual artist and filmmaker and writer who hails from Mexico City. So it sounds like it's not terribly long either. It's 292 pages. So it sounds like it deals a little bit with possession by malevolent spirits based on the jacket blurb. But anyway, that'll be our next book.
I know Ronnie is traveling. I'm going to be traveling. We're going to get episodes in as we would, but let's take a break. Let's focus on watching some films and doing some film talks, and then we will do book discussion. Our next book discussion episode will happen in January. We'll be ready to go. That'll be like right out of the gate. Maybe even our first episode of January will be book club discussion. So you have plenty of time to get this book read so that you can be part of this with us. You can find us online at Scream Sister on both Instagram and Threads. And then you can find us on at Scream Sister Pod over on YouTube. And then, of course, our internet home, screamsister.com. And if you want to email us about anything, we are at screamsisterpod@gmail.com. All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us. And we will be back again. I think we've got one more episode this month.
Bye. And those that are living in the States and who observe Thanksgiving, happy Thanksgiving.
Okay. See everyone later. Bye. Scream Sister is a Nest production hosted by Veronica and me, Valerie. Editing by me. Music by Omar Chakor. Production support for this episode provided by Lorenzo Villarreal and Alex Street. Listen to new episodes every other Monday, and don't forget to give us a rate and review. It is the best way to help us grow.